The Grand Marlowe Hotel was the kind of place people went to feel important. Everything about it was made to impress, from the crystal chandeliers that sparkled like frozen rain to the deep red carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps. Guests who came here weren't just looking for a room or a meal. They came for the experience, the sense that for a few hours they were part of something grand. In one quiet corner of the hotel's restaurant sat a polished black piano. Every evening, without fail, the soft sound of live music floated through the room. The man behind those melodies was Edward Lane, the hotel's resident pianist. He was in his early 60s, tall but slightly bent from years of sitting at the instrument. His hair, once dark, had now turned mostly silver, and his hands, though aged, still moved with a calm, confident grace. For most guests, Edward was simply part of the background, like the chandeliers or the fine art hanging on the walls. But for those who paid attention, his music carried something deeper. There was a quiet emotion in the way he played, a kind of unspoken story that made people pause even for a moment. Edward had been playing at the Grand Marlowe for almost 10 years. Before that, he had been a concert pianist traveling from city to city. He used to perform on big stages, wearing tuxedos and receiving standing ovations, but life had its own way of humbling people. A car accident many years ago had injured his left hand, ending his concert career. After that, the glamorous world of fame slowly faded away. Still, music was all he had ever known, so he found work wherever he could, small restaurants, weddings, and finally, the Marlowe. He didn't mind the change. The hotel job was steady and peaceful. Every night he sat by the piano at 7 sharp, greeted the staff with a warm nod, and played until midnight. He didn't speak much, but his music said enough. That evening began like any other. The restaurant was softly lit, filled with the quiet clatter of silverware and the faint hum of conversation. The smell of roasted lamb and wine drifted through the air. Guests laughed over dinner. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, and Edward's piano filled the spaces between words. He started with a gentle tune, a classic piece that blended easily with the sound of the evening. His fingers moved effortlessly across the keys. He knew this routine by heart. The rhythm, the pauses, the way people's voices dipped slightly when they heard a familiar melody. It was comforting, predictable. Around 8:30, the doors of the restaurant opened and a small group entered. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in an expensive suit. The staff greeted him quickly, almost nervously, as if they recognized him. The maitre d' hurried forward, shaking his hand and showing him to a prime table near the center of the room. The man's name was Charles Davenport. He was one of those people everyone seemed to know, or at least knew about. A wealthy businessman known for his big deals and even bigger attitude. He had money, power, and a reputation for treating service staff like they were invisible. Tonight, he had brought along a few associates for what looked like a business dinner. As they settled into their seats, Charles glanced around the restaurant, clearly enjoying the attention. He adjusted his gold cufflinks and leaned back in his chair, speaking loudly enough that nearby guests could hear him. His laughter boomed over the gentle piano music, breaking the calm mood of the room. Edward noticed him, of course, but didn't react. He'd seen people like Charles before, men who wore their wealth like armor. So he kept playing, letting his fingers glide over the keys. But halfway through a piece, a faint sound came from the piano, a slightly off note. Edward corrected it immediately, but it didn't escape Charles's sharp eyes. Charles turned to his companions with a smirk. "Even the help can't stay in tune tonight," he said loudly. A few of his friends chuckled while others looked away embarrassed. The comment reached Edward's ears. For a moment his heart sank, not because he was angry, but because after all these years he still hadn't gotten used to the sting of public humiliation, but he had learned how to handle it. He simply straightened his back, nodded politely in Charles's direction, and continued playing as if nothing had happened. To him, music was a refuge, a place where words couldn't hurt. Across the room, a few guests noticed what had happened. Some frowned, whispering quietly while others pretended not to see. The tension hung in the air for a moment before fading back into the usual rhythm of dinner. Edward finished his piece and took a short break. He usually stepped away for a few minutes every hour, just to rest his hands. He went to the side of the room where a small glass of water waited for him. The staff smiled at him with quiet sympathy, but Edward waved it off gently. "It's all right," he said softly. "He's just had too much wine." He returned to his seat and began another song, a soft waltz filled with emotion but calm enough to keep the atmosphere light. Still, something in his playing had changed. The notes carried a hint of sadness, almost like he was telling a story without words. A few diners, who had been deep in conversation, slowly fell silent, listening more closely than before. At Charles Davenport's table, the laughter continued. He ordered more drinks, and the waiters hurried to serve him. The man clearly enjoyed the power he held over the room. Edward noticed how the staff tensed up whenever they passed his table. Even from the piano he could sense the discomfort, but Edward didn't let that spoil his night. He reminded himself that not everyone in the room was cruel. There were couples who held hands as they listened, an elderly woman who smiled at every song, and even a young boy near the back who kept peeking over the table to watch him play. That was what mattered. The music wasn't for the loud or the proud. It was for those quiet hearts that still listened. As the night went on, the restaurant began to fill with more guests. The air grew warmer, the noise louder. The pianist adjusted his stool and started a livelier tune to match the mood. Yet in the middle of all this, he couldn't help noticing how Charles's laughter seemed to dominate the room. At one point, during a particularly quiet passage of a song, Charles's voice rang out again. "Play something cheerful, will you? You're putting my guest to sleep." A few people turned their heads. The man's tone wasn't kind, it was mocking. Edward's fingers hesitated for just a second before continuing. He looked up briefly, caught Charles's smirking expression, and gave a polite nod. "Of course, sir," he said softly. He switched to a lighter piece, one that sounded cheerful and bright. But under the surface, the notes carried something else, a quiet strength, a defiance that no insult could touch. Inside, Edward felt a familiar ache. Not anger, but sadness. He had met so many people like this over the years. People who mistook kindness for weakness, who thought wealth gave them the right to judge others. But he also knew that the best answer wasn't through words. It was through music, and so he played. The song rose and fell like waves, filling the room with warmth again. Guests returned to their conversations, and the earlier tension began to fade. Even Charles, for a while, seemed to forget about him. By the time Edward reached the final notes of the evening's set, the room was calm once again. The hotel lights reflected softly off the piano's surface, and the sound of applause, light but sincere, echoed through the air. Edward gave a small bow, smiled, and quietly closed the piano lid. He didn't need grand praise or attention. His reward was simple, the knowledge that for a few hours, he had made the world around him just a little more beautiful. As the last guests began to leave, the staff moved quietly around, clearing tables and resetting for the next day. Edward gathered his sheet music and slipped it into his worn leather bag. He looked up once more at the empty chairs and thought about how tomorrow would be just another night, another performance. What he didn't know was that the next evening, when that same wealthy guest returned, would change everything. For now, though he left the Grand Marlowe with tired hands and a calm heart, stepping into the cool night air, the city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, and he smiled to himself. No matter what people said, as long as he had his music, he would never truly be defeated. And somewhere inside, a quiet promise formed, a promise that when the moment came, his music would speak louder than any insult ever could. The next evening came quietly. The city outside was alive with weekend chatter, cars passing by, couples laughing, the smell of rain still hanging in the air. Inside the Grand Marlowe Hotel, everything was set just as before. Candles were lit, the piano was polished, and the dining room filled slowly with guests looking forward to a peaceful dinner. Edward arrived early, as he always did. He walked through the side entrance, carrying his leather bag with sheet music tucked neatly inside. The staff greeted him warmly. He had become like family to them over the years. The head waiter, a kind young man, offered him a gentle smile and said, "Good evening, sir." "Full house tonight again," Edward smiled back. "That's good to hear. Let's make it a pleasant night." He sat down at the piano and pressed a few keys to test the sound. The familiar feel of the keys under his fingers always calmed him. No matter what happened outside those walls, when he touched the piano, the world seemed to slow down. He could breathe again. The first hour passed beautifully. He played light, cheerful tunes that matched the hum of conversation in the room. Some guests nodded their heads to the rhythm, others smiled quietly, and a few even clapped between songs. The night was smooth, peaceful, and perfectly ordinary, until the doors opened again. Charles Davenport had returned. He entered the restaurant with his usual air of importance, his coat draped over one arm, and a look that suggested the whole room existed for his entertainment. This time he wasn't with business partners. Instead, he was accompanied by a young woman in a sparkling blue dress. She seemed nervous, her eyes scanning the grand hall with wonder, while he moved with the confidence of a man who owned everything he saw. The staff rushed to welcome him, pulling out chairs and offering menus. Charles waved them off casually and leaned back, ordering a bottle of wine without even looking at the waiter. From his seat, he could see the piano clearly, and it didn't take long before he noticed Edward sitting there again. A small grin appeared on his face, one that didn't promise kindness. Edward saw him too, but he didn't let it disturb his focus. He greeted the man with a polite nod and continued playing. The melody was soft and graceful like a calm evening breeze. Guests were enjoying it, but Charles seemed more interested in being noticed. He poured himself a glass of wine and started talking loudly, his voice cutting across the music. "You know, I could have been a musician myself," he said, laughing. "But I had better things to do, like making real money." A few guests looked up, uncomfortable. Edward heard the words but stayed silent, his expression calm. The young woman sitting with Charles gave a small, uneasy smile, trying to quiet him. "Please," she whispered, "let him play. It's beautiful." But Charles wasn't the kind of man who liked being told to be quiet. "Beautiful?" he repeated with a mocking tone. Maybe to someone who doesn't know what real music sounds like. "This is hotel background noise, nothing more." A murmur passed through the tables. People were beginning to notice the tension. Some looked at Edward, others at Charles. The staff hesitated, unsure if they should step in. Edward paused for a second, his fingers resting gently on the keys. Then he looked up and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Would you like to hear something special, sir?" he asked politely. "Perhaps I can play something you prefer." Charles leaned forward, clearly enjoying the attention. "Something special, All right, show me what you've got. Play something with real emotion. Or are you just trained to follow the notes?" The challenge hung in the air like a sharp wind. The young woman lowered her head, embarrassed. The rest of the restaurant went silent. Even the waiters froze in place, their trays hovering mid-air. For a moment, Edward didn't move. His face was calm, but inside his heart was beating faster. He had spent his entire life trying to let his music speak for him. Tonight, it seemed he would need it to speak louder than ever. He gave a small nod. "As you wish," he said softly. Then he began to play. The first few notes were low, almost like a whisper. The sound was slow and full of feeling, something unlike the light dinner tunes from before. The melody told a story, though no one in the room could put it into words. It carried sadness and hope, pain and peace all at once. It was as if the piano itself had found a voice of its own. At first, people listened quietly. Then the energy in the room began to shift. The conversation stopped completely, and every face turned toward the pianist. The only sounds were the notes echoing through the grand hall. Charles leaned back, his smirk fading just a little. There was something different about this music. It wasn't just skill, it was emotion, raw and deep. Each note seemed to reach out and touch something inside the listeners. The young woman beside him felt tears gather in her eyes without knowing why. Edward's hands moved effortlessly across the keys, faster now, then slower, painting emotions the way words never could. Memories filled his mind as he played. His late wife smiling at him from the front row of his old concerts, the long nights he spent relearning how to move his injured hand, the loneliness that had followed him for years. He poured all of it into the music. The melody rose, filling every corner of the restaurant. The guests were completely silent. The waiters stood frozen, their trays still in hand. The sound was powerful, beautiful, heartbreaking. It felt like time itself had stopped. Even Charles, the man who had mocked him just minutes before, seemed unable to speak. His expression softened, his arrogant grin fading completely. He didn't understand why, but something in that music broke through his pride. He looked around and saw everyone's eyes fixed on the pianist, some smiling, some wiping tears. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was almost unreal. It felt heavy, sacred. Then slowly one person began to clap, Another joined, and soon the entire room erupted in applause. People stood up cheering, clapping, whistling. Some even shouted, "Bravo!" with genuine admiration. Edward stood, bowed once, and smiled humbly. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The music had said everything for him. Charles Davenport remained seated, stunned. His hands rested on the table, his eyes distant. He had never been silenced before, certainly not by a hotel pianist. The young woman beside him placed a hand on his arm gently, but he didn't move. When Edward sat down again to continue his next piece, the applause slowly faded into a respectful quiet. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. People were kinder now, more thoughtful. Even the sound of cutlery was softer, as if no one wanted to disturb the magic that still lingered in the air. Charles eventually stood up. He straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and walked toward the piano. Every eye followed him, wondering what he would do next. Edward looked up, his expression calm as always. For a moment, Charles didn't say anything. Then, in a quieter voice than anyone had ever heard from him, he said, "I was wrong. That was something else." Edward smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Music has its own way of speaking." Charles nodded, still looking slightly lost. "Yes," he murmured. "It certainly does." He returned to his table, his confidence replaced by something softer, humility. The young woman gave him a small smile as if to say she was proud of him for once. The rest of the night passed peacefully. Edward continued playing gentle melodies until the dinner ended. When the guests began to leave, many stopped to thank him personally, some shaking his hand, others simply smiling in gratitude. A few even said they had never heard anything so moving in their lives. After the crowd thinned out, Edward packed up his sheet music slowly. The manager approached him and said, "You gave everyone something special tonight." "Thank you." Edward smiled, his eyes calm and kind. "It was just a song," he said softly. "But sometimes a song can remind people of who they really are." As he walked out of the hotel that night, the air felt fresh, almost new. The streets were quiet, the rain had stopped, and the faint light from street lamps shimmered on the wet road. Edward took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. He didn't think about the applause or the attention. What mattered was that for one brief moment through music, he had reminded a man, and perhaps an entire room, what respect and humanity truly meant. And though he didn't know it yet, that single performance would be remembered at the Grand Marlowe for years to come. As the night, a pianist silenced a room without saying a word. The next morning, the Grand Marlowe Hotel was unusually quiet. The night before had been unforgettable. Everyone was still talking about it. Staff members exchanged small smiles as they went about their work, retelling the story of how the humble pianist had turned the room silent with a single performance. Edward arrived later than usual that day. He had spent the morning walking through the park near his small apartment. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you think more deeply than usual. He had been thinking about what happened the night before, not about the applause or the attention, but about the look on the face of that wealthy guest, Charles Davenport. For years, Edward had played for hundreds of people, maybe thousands, but never before had his music changed the mood of a room so completely. It wasn't pride that he felt. It was something gentler, a quiet sense of peace. For once, he felt that his music had truly reached someone's heart. When he walked into the hotel that afternoon, the receptionist greeted him with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lane," she said cheerfully. "You were the talk of the evening last night. Everyone's been asking about you." Edward chuckled softly. "Oh, I'm sure it was just a moment," he said modestly. "People will forget soon enough." But she shook her head. "Not this time. You made quite an impression." He thanked her and continued down the hall toward the restaurant. As he passed through the lobby, a few guests nodded at him in recognition. Some smiled politely, and one even stopped him to say, "Your performance last night was beautiful. It reminded me of my late husband." "Thank you for that." Her kind words made his heart warm. He bowed his head slightly and said, "I'm honored, ma'am." By evening, the restaurant was busy again. Candles flickered on the tables, and the scent of roasted herbs filled the air. Edward sat down at the piano, ran his fingers gently across the keys, and began his first tune of the night. The melody was soft, like a conversation between old friends. About an hour later, as he was finishing a piece, he noticed a familiar figure standing at the entrance. It was Charles Davenport. But something was different about him. His usual confident stride was gone. He stood quietly, almost unsure of himself. The young woman who had been with him before wasn't there this time. He was alone. Edward watched him approach slowly, holding a small envelope in his hand. When he reached the piano, he waited for the song to end, then spoke quietly. "Good evening," he said. Edward gave a polite nod. "Good evening, sir." Charles looked around awkwardly, then back at him. "I hope I'm not disturbing your performance," he said. "Not at all," Edward replied gently. There was a long pause before Charles finally spoke again. "I came to apologize. For the other night. For the way I spoke to you." The words surprised Edward, though he didn't show it. He could tell this wasn't easy for the man. Charles cleared his throat and continued, "I behaved poorly. I had no right to speak to you that way. You didn't deserve that." Edward looked at him quietly, then gave a small, kind smile. "We all have moments we wish we could take back," he said. "But I appreciate your words." Charles nodded slowly. "You know," he said, "that performance, it stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't even understand why. I've heard great musicians before, some of the best. But what you played that night, it wasn't just music. It felt honest." Edward's eyes softened. "Music can do that," he said. "It speaks where words cannot." Charles smiled faintly, still holding the envelope. "I didn't know your story until today," he said. "The manager told me you used to be a concert pianist. You could have been playing in the biggest halls in the country. What happened?" Edward paused for a moment before answering. "Life happened," he said simply. "An accident changed things. But I'm grateful to still have the chance to play here. I may not be on grand stages anymore, but I still get to make people feel something. That's what matters to me." Charles listened silently, the expression on his face softening even more. Then he placed the envelope gently on the piano. "This is for you," he said. "Please don't refuse it. It's not a payment. It's gratitude. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, what it means to feel." Edward hesitated, then accepted it politely. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "That means a great deal." Charles nodded once, then stepped back. "I'll leave you to your music," he said, his voice lower now, almost humble. As he walked away, Edward opened the envelope just enough to see what was inside. It wasn't money as he had feared. Instead, there was a small handwritten note. It read, "To the pianist who taught me that not everything valuable comes with a price tag. Thank you for the lesson." Edward smiled softly and folded the note back into the envelope. That night, when he began his next piece, he felt something different in the air. The music came easier, richer. His heart felt light. The guests could sense it too. His playing had always been beautiful, but tonight it was alive with something pure and real. As the night went on, Edward noticed that Charles hadn't left. He was sitting quietly at the bar now, listening. He wasn't drinking or talking loudly, just listening. When Edward looked up once, their eyes met briefly. Charles raised his glass slightly in a silent gesture of respect. Edward nodded back with a warm smile. The room filled with peace. Guests whispered softly to one another, saying how magical the music felt that evening. The waiters moved slowly as if not wanting to disturb the spell that hung in the air. By the time Edward played his final song of the night, even the candles seemed to burn brighter. When the last note faded, the applause came again, but it was softer this time, more intimate, more heartfelt. It was the kind of applause that said, "Thank you," not just "well done." After everyone left, Edward sat alone for a while at the piano. He touched the keys gently as if thanking them too. Then he looked again at the note Charles had given him and read it once more. Not everything valuable comes with a price tag. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his music book. It would stay there as a reminder of the night when music changed more than just the mood of a room. The following week, the hotel manager called him into his office. "Edward," he said with a proud smile, "I have some good news. A local journalist wants to write about you, about what happened the other night. They said the story has been going around town. People are inspired." Edward blinked in surprise. "Inspired by me?" The manager nodded. "Yes, they want to feature you in a column about kindness and art. I think it's well-deserved." Edward smiled shyly. "That's very kind, but I didn't do anything special. I just played the piano." The manager chuckled. "Sometimes the simplest things touch people the deepest." That evening, as Edward prepared for another performance, A new sense of quiet pride filled him. He realized something important, that no stage, no fame, no spotlight could ever compare to touching a human heart through genuine feeling. When he began to play, there was peace in every note. He didn't play for applause or recognition. He played for the quiet souls in the room, the tired waiter, the lonely guest, the couple sharing their anniversary dinner. For all of them, his music was a small comfort in a noisy world. And far across the room, near the same corner table, Charles Davenport sat once more. But this time he wasn't a man trying to show off his wealth. He was just another listener, quietly letting the music fill the spaces he hadn't known were empty. Edward smiled faintly as he played. Sometimes life gives people a second chance, not to prove themselves, but to remind them who they really are. And as the final note drifted into the night air, everyone in the Grand Marlowe Hotel felt it. The simple, powerful truth that kindness, humility, and art could change even the hardest of hearts. The following morning, the Grand Marlowe Hotel seemed quieter than usual. Perhaps it was the calm after the storm of the previous nights. Guests lingered over breakfast, speaking in hushed tones, and the staff moved more deliberately, as if still savoring the memory of what had happened. For Edward, mornings were usually calm, almost sacred. He liked to arrive early before the restaurant filled with guests, to touch the piano and let his hands remember the keys in peace. That day, however, was different. There was a certain energy in the air, something subtle yet tangible. As Edward walked into the hall, he noticed the staff exchanging knowing glances. The manager approached him holding a small stack of letters. "Edward," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "These arrived overnight. All for you." Edward accepted them, feeling the weight of the envelopes in his hands. They were from strangers, people who had read about the pianist who had silenced a room with his music. Some were short notes of thanks. Others shared long stories about how the music had reminded them of someone they had lost, or a moment they had once cherished. A few even contained sketches and photographs inspired by the melodies he had played. He sat at the piano, opening the letters carefully. Each one carried a piece of someone's heart, and Edward felt an unexpected warmth rising in his chest. Over the years, he had played countless notes, but rarely had he realized the quiet ripple of impact music could create. By late afternoon, he began to prepare for the evening's performance. The restaurant slowly filled with familiar faces. Some were locals who had heard of him through the newspaper column. Others were regular guests who had come to expect a gentle melody with their dinner. And in a quiet corner, he noticed Charles Davenport again. The man had become a regular almost without announcement. But there was something different in his posture now. Less arrogance, more attentiveness, as if he were learning to listen not just with his ears, but with his heart. Edward started the first piece, a soft and tender tune that seemed to weave through the room like sunlight. People leaned forward, captivated by the melody. Some closed their eyes, letting the notes wash over them, while others smiled quietly, lost in memory. The music felt alive, delicate, and at the same time powerful. Halfway through the evening, a young boy approached the piano. He was no older than 10, shyly peeking around the corner as Edward played. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder, and he held a small notebook clutched tightly in his hands. When the song ended, he whispered, "Excuse me." "Sir?" Edward looked down and smiled gently. "Yes, little one? How can I help you? I want to learn how to play like you," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly. "I can't play very well yet, but I try." Edward nodded, his eyes softening. "Do you have a piano at home?" "Yes," the boy said. "But I get frustrated. I make mistakes all the time." Edward paused for a brief moment, allowing the silence to linger. The piano's notes were gentle, yet they carried weight beyond what words could express. That was the magic of music. It could tell a story without a single sentence. And tonight, Edward realized, it was not only touching strangers' hearts, but also gently reshaping the hearts of those who had forgotten how to feel deeply. As he played the final note, the room stayed silent for a heartbeat, savoring the moment. Then the applause came, soft but genuine, filling the space with warmth. Edward bowed slightly, acknowledging the guests, but his mind wandered elsewhere. He thought of the boy who wanted to learn, the letters he had received, and the countless unseen ways music had already reached people he would never meet. After the performance, Charles Davenport approached him quietly. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just a man humbled by something larger than himself. "I don't know how to say this," he murmured. "I never thought I'd be moved like this by anything. But you've shown me that there is more to life than wealth, than appearances. You've reminded me what it feels like to truly notice something beautiful." Edward nodded gently. "Sometimes we all need a reminder," he said. "Life is busy. People forget to notice, to feel. Music just nudges them back." Charles placed a hand lightly on the piano. "You've done more than that," he said quietly. "You've changed how I see things." "I will never forget this," Edward offered a small, humble smile. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said. "I only played what I felt." But the truth was, what he felt had resonated far more deeply than he could have imagined. That evening, Edward realized something important. Art, whether music, painting, writing, or even a simple gesture of kindness, had the power to transform lives in ways that money or status never could. And sometimes the greatest victories came not from being recognized, but from quietly touching someone else's soul. As the restaurant emptied, Edward remained at the piano for a few more minutes. He pressed the keys softly, letting the sound fade into the calm night. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and candle wax, carrying the memory of laughter, tears, and quiet admiration. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of all the small moments that had led him here, the long nights of practice, the setbacks, the losses, and the tiny victories. Each one had built this moment, this quiet connection between music and humanity. When he finally stood, he felt a sense of calm he had rarely experienced. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, and yet he had something far more valuable: the ability to touch lives, to inspire, and to heal through music. As he walked through the lobby toward the exit, he noticed one final letter left on the reception desk. He picked it up and read it quietly. "Thank you for reminding me that life is not about what we have, but about what we feel. Your music made me believe again." Edward smiled softly, folding it carefully into his coat pocket. He stepped out into the night, the air cool and fresh, carrying with him a quiet sense of purpose. The city around him continued its restless hum, unaware of the small miracles that had occurred within the Grand Marlowe that evening. Edward walked slowly, thinking of the boy, the letters, and the man who had finally begun to understand humility. And he realized that the true gift of music wasn't applause, recognition, or wealth. It was the quiet ability to make someone pause, reflect, and feel. Tonight had been another reminder. A reminder that a single performance could shift hearts, mend broken spirits, and even teach lessons that no amount of money could buy. And as Edward disappeared into the cool night streets, the piano inside the hotel waited patiently for the next evening, ready to continue its silent work, connecting hearts, one note at a time. The next morning at the Grand Marlowe Hotel felt different. There was a quiet energy, one that was subtle but unmistakable. Guests moved about the lobby with a gentler pace, and the staff exchanged smiles that seemed brighter than usual. Word had spread about the pianist whose music had silenced a room. And now it wasn't just the hotel staff or the regular visitors who were talking. It was the city itself. People had begun visiting specifically to hear Edward play, curious about the man whose music had touched so many hearts. Edward arrived early, as usual. The lobby smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood, but there was also the faint, comforting scent of the morning coffee from the cafe. He walked toward the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys. The notes felt familiar, almost like old friends greeting him. He remembered the past week vividly, the wealthy guest who had tried to humiliate him, the moment that had silenced the room, the letters of gratitude, the boy who wanted to learn, and Charles Davenport, who had slowly begun to understand humility. Each memory carried a lesson, and tonight he felt ready for whatever the evening might bring. The restaurant began to fill with anticipation. Some guests were regulars, some were newcomers who had read about him in the column, and a few were simply drawn by curiosity. Edward sensed their excitement, but he didn't feel nervous. There was a calm assurance in his heart. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about sharing a piece of himself through music. As he began to play, the room quieted immediately. The opening notes of the first piece were soft, gentle, almost whispering. Guests leaned in, listening carefully, as though every note carried a secret meant only for them. The music moved effortlessly, weaving through joy, sorrow, hope, and reflection. Edward's fingers danced over the keys with a fluidity that made the piano sing like it never had before. Halfway through the evening, the door opened quietly. Edward glanced up and saw Charles Davenport entering once again. But this time he was different. He wasn't there to assert authority or show off wealth. He simply walked to a corner seat, removed his coat, and sat quietly, hands folded on the table, eyes focused on Edward. There was a newfound respect in his gaze, a humility that hadn't been there before. As the night progressed, more people began to listen intently, drawn into the melodies as if the piano were telling their own stories. Edward played with a rare vulnerability, letting every emotion come through without restraint. Some guests wiped tears from their eyes. Others held hands across tables while a few simply sat in stillness, absorbing the music. Suddenly the door opened again, and a small group of children entered, led by their teacher. They had come from a nearby school after hearing about the pianist who could move hearts. The children watched quietly, some whispering to one another, others wide-eyed and amazed. Edward smiled subtly, thinking of the boy from a few nights ago who had approached him with his notebook. He began to play a lighter, more playful tune, one that invited curiosity and imagination. The children's faces lit up. They swayed gently to the music, some tapping on the edges of their chairs, others humming along softly. Edward's heart warmed. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen this path, why he had continued playing even after life had thrown obstacles in his way. Music was not just sound, it was connection, it was understanding, it was hope. As he transitioned into a deeper, more emotional piece, he noticed Charles Davenport watching closely. The man's eyes were no longer filled with judgment or pride. They were filled with something else entirely: recognition. He had finally seen what true talent and integrity meant, beyond wealth and status. Edward played with everything he had, letting every note convey a story of resilience, humility, and quiet courage. When the final note lingered in the air, the room stayed silent for a moment longer than usual. The weight of the music, the emotions it carried, settled into every corner. Then slowly, applause began, soft at first, then growing louder. But it wasn't just polite clapping, it was heartfelt. People stood, some moved to tears, others smiling through emotion, all acknowledging the depth of what they had just experienced. Charles Davenport stood as well. He approached Edward, hesitated for a moment, and then extended his hand. I don't have words," he said quietly. "I thought I understood the world, but you've shown me that there's more than I ever imagined. I was wrong, and I'm grateful you reminded me." Edward took his hand, a gentle smile on his face. "We all have moments where we forget what matters," he said softly. "It's never too late to remember." The applause slowly subsided, and the guests began leaving the restaurant, carrying with them the memory of the evening, the music, and the emotions it had stirred. Edward stayed by the piano, letting the silence wash over him. It was a peaceful, full silence, one that spoke of fulfillment, gratitude, and quiet triumph. Later that night, after the last guest had left, Edward sat alone in the restaurant, reflecting on the events of the past week. He thought about the letters he had received, the boy who wanted to learn, the wealthy man who had learned humility, and the countless others who had been touched by his music. Each encounter had reminded him that life's most valuable gifts were not measured by money or status. They were measured by connection, empathy, and the ability to touch someone's heart. He looked out of the window at the city lights, glowing softly in the night. Somewhere out there, strangers were carrying pieces of his music with them, remembering the emotions it had evoked. That thought brought a quiet smile to his face. The piano, now silent, seemed to hold its own sense of contentment. It had been a vessel for something greater than itself, and for Edward that was enough. He realized that success was not about recognition, applause, or wealth. Success was about the impact you leave behind, the hearts you touch, and the lives you quietly change without expecting anything in return. In the days that followed, more people visited the hotel to hear Edward play. Some were journalists, some were curious travelers, and some were local residents who had heard the story. But Edward played as he always had, not for attention, not for fame, but for the simple, profound joy of sharing music. Charles Davenport continued to visit occasionally, always respectful, always listening. Over time, he even began bringing young people with him, teaching them the value of humility, respect and appreciation for talent beyond money. He had been transformed quietly without fanfare by the power of genuine human connection. And then there was the boy, who began visiting Edward regularly to learn piano. Slowly his skills grew, but more importantly, his confidence and sense of patience grew too. Edward became a mentor, not just teaching music, but teaching something deeper, the value of perseverance, empathy, and the quiet joy of creating something meaningful. Months later, the story of that night, the wealthy guest who had tried to humiliate the pianist, and the performance that silenced the room, had become a small legend in the city. But Edward never boasted about it. He continued to play for those who came, sharing music as if it were a gift meant for every ear. Every heart, every soul that needed it. One evening, as he sat at the piano, Edward thought about how fragile and beautiful life could be. A single moment, a single note could change someone forever. He smiled softly, realizing that in those fleeting instances music and humanity intersected in the most profound way. And sometimes that was all anyone needed to find meaning, to learn humility, to feel hope again. The Grand Marlowe Hotel continued to host its guests, filled with laughter, quiet conversations, and the soft glow of candlelight. And in its heart the piano sat patiently, waiting for the next evening, the next note, the next moment when a melody could touch a soul and remind the world that true wealth was not in money, but in connection, kindness, and the courage to feel deeply. Edward Lane, the pianist who had once been unnoticed, had become something far greater, not because of fame or wealth or applause, but because he had shared his gifts sincerely and in doing so, had reminded everyone who heard him of what really mattered in life. And in the quiet that followed his last note, the world seemed, just for a moment, a little softer, a little kinder, and a little more alive.